The White House has announced new trade tariffs for dozens of countries just hours before a self-imposed midnight deadline. President Trump has signed a new executive order imposing higher levies on imports from a swathe of trading partners ranging as high as 41%. These are due to come into effect on August 7th. The White House has separately announced that many goods from neighboring Canada will face a new 35% levy starting Friday. Now let's discuss this with Evan Dyer. He's a senior reporter with CBC in Canada. Evan, good to have you with us. What does this now mean for Canadian businesses and goods and trade as a whole?
Well, I should say that it's not as threatening as it might sound. A 35% tariff, if it were applied across the board, would be devastating to Canada because so much of its trade goes into the United States. But really, this is not affecting more than about 10% of goods crossing the border from Canada into the U.S. because goods that can be traded under USMCA, which is sort of the new NAFTA, are exempt. They're exempt from this tariff. And in fact, this blanket 35% tariff is probably less of a threat to the Canadian economy than the steel and aluminum tariffs of 50% that really do have to be paid by those two industries, and that are particularly threatening to the steel industry. The aluminum industry has been through this before, of course, in Trump's first term, and it weathered things pretty well. But the steel industry in Canada is more vulnerable in the sense that the American steel industry is more capable of replacing it. The Canadian aluminum industry could not be replaced by the U.S. aluminum industry. In fact, there's one smelter in Quebec that produces more aluminum than the entire United States. But these new tariffs are not just a symbolic threat. Of course, even 10% of the goods traffic going across the border into the United States is about 7% of overall Canadian trade. But it's not as serious as it would be if the USMCA was not exempt. And the U.S. still has not reached for that sort of big gun that it could reach for, which would be to include the USMCA traded goods as well.
Right, Evan, but why has Canada been hit with this 35% tariff in comparison to other countries?
I think Donald Trump has almost seemed at times to want to make an example of Canada, perhaps believing that as a close neighbor that is traditionally friendly with the United States, a country that has a good relationship with the United States, that sort of making an example of Canada might in some way achieve some sort of exemplary effect on other countries, perhaps. Certainly, Canada has been forced to go back and forth with Donald Trump through a few different rounds of negotiation where tariffs have come on, come off, or been threatened and then dropped right at the last moment. In fact, this has been so confusing. It's actually very difficult for people to be exactly sure what tariffs apply at any given moment. We try to keep a running tally of what is actually being charged, what has merely been threatened, and what has been imposed but isn't being applied to USMCA traded goods. And it's a constantly shifting target. And then very often, too, there are members of the Trump administration who contradict each other. And this has all led the government of Canada to take a policy of responding only to what the U.S. does, not what the U.S. says.
I was just going to hit on that point, Evan, that unlike the other countries whose tariffs were hit on the 7th of August, Canada's hitting right away. So how do we expect Canada to react?
Well, there is pressure within Canada from a very prominent premier, the premier of Canada's biggest province, Ontario, to retaliate immediately. Typically, these tariffs, I should say, come with a threat, which is that if you retaliate, we will increase the tariff further. So, of course, when Canada was initially hit with a 25% tariff by Donald Trump, it did respond. And it attempted to respond on a dollar-for-dollar basis, which is hard for Canada to do because the U.S. economy is 10 times the size, but which Canada has been able to do so far. But, there is pressure to retaliate to these two. But of course, there's a knowledge that Donald Trump can then always just come back and raise it again. And we have seen him do that with other countries. So it seems likely that as long as USMCA goods are exempt, Canada may hold its powder for a little while, may try to hold off and continue this negotiation because they are in the middle of a negotiation that is supposed to reach a final deal, a grand bargain. And for us to retaliate and then to get into a short-term tit-for-tat war on tariffs might not be the most effective approach. So it may be that this time, for the first time, the federal government, the government of Canada, will resist that pressure from people like the Premier of Ontario to hit straight back and instead try to reach that grand bargain in the next few days.
I'm just wondering one last one before we go, Evan, but overall, how does this affect the already strained relations between the two countries, briefly?
Well, I can tell you that Canadians are unhappy with this, and this is reflected in boycotts of consumer goods, a dramatic decrease in cross-border travel. Canadians often spend the winters in places like Florida and Arizona. We've seen people selling their second homes or simply just not going and going instead to Portugal instead of Florida, for example. One of the things that has caused a lot of irritation is the pretext behind these tariffs, because these tariffs against Canada are being applied because Canada supposedly is the source of fentanyl entering the United States. And that simply is not true. We look at the statistics of fentanyl being seized crossing the border. And last year, we saw about 20 times as much fentanyl seized entering Canada from the United States as in the United States coming from Canada. And of the fentanyl seized going into the United States, 99% of it entered across the Mexican border, and less than 1%, I think it was less than half of 1% came through Canada. So this is widely seen in Canada as a false pretext.
Okay.
And that, of course, makes people even less inclined to accept it.
All right. Journalist Evan Dyer from CBC in Canada, thank you very much for giving us that view. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Asian markets are already reacting to the White House's increased tariffs, with shares falling across the region. Countries across Asia have been hit with rates ranging from 15% on South Korean goods to 25% for those coming from India. Laos and Myanmar have both been hit particularly hard with a levy of 40%, one of the highest rates the U.S. has imposed so far. But despite the damage, some countries across the region have expressed relief that the tariffs are not as high as initially threatened. Let's discuss these new tariffs further with Ian Chong, Associate Professor of Political Science at the National University of Singapore. Good to have you with us. Now, we've mentioned the Asian markets already falling with news of these tariffs. What impact are the tariffs overall likely to have on Southeast Asian markets, including Singapore, where you are?
So I think the impact will be quite varied depending on what the specific economy looks like. So for Singapore, we have a 10% tariff, largely because we have a trade deficit with the United States. But of course, you have other countries with ranging between 17 to 19 to 20%. Of course, with Myanmar at 40, that's a bit of an outlier. So it's really those countries and economies that have a large manufacturing base that will be hit harder. Some of those economies, such as Vietnam, that had benefited from previously that China plus one strategy, will be hit somewhat, I think. And all the economies in Southeast Asia will be hit by the transshipment rules that come in with the tariffs, because one of the ways that the PRC companies have been trying to get into the China market, into the US market previously with the restriction, was to work through Southeast Asia. So those things will, I think, be at play. There are a couple of other things to watch. One is that for companies that are looking to invest, that have invested across Southeast Asia, and use those factories to sort of produce things for the US market, there will be sort of knock-on effects for the investor. So, for instance, Singapore, we may have a trade deficit in goods with the US, but we invest a lot across the region. So those companies will be hit. So that's one area to watch. The other area to watch, I suppose, is there will be knock-on effects on the PRC if their tariff talks don't work out. So their goods will come to Southeast Asia, and that will put pressure on Southeast Asian manufacturers especially.
Right. The Cambodian Prime Minister said the 19% tariff rate imposed on the country is described this as the best news. Is there reason for these countries to be jubilant that the tariffs weren't any higher?
So I think given the sort of original fear that you're looking at the upper 20s or even the sort of lower 30s, to have anything lower than that is a plus. And the other thing to note is that if the tariff rates among Southeast Asian economies are relatively similar, for those economies that compete in similar sectors, they're not relatively disadvantaged. So it's economies, if you have a much higher tariff rate than your neighbor that produces very similar things, then you would really hurt. But if it's more or less similar, then the sort of relative loss isn't that much.
And just to wrap up, considering this is an export-dependent region, if such a big market as the US is affected by higher prices, then what options do these countries have?
They'll have to diversify. They are looking at India, they are looking at China, but as you know, the Chinese economy too is suffering from lower consumption. So they'll have to diversify even further, look to Europe, look to Africa, the Middle East. So the other thing to note is, I think for many countries in the region, they've been talking about the importance of the China market and the relative lack of importance of the US market. The eagerness to strike deals with the US suggests that the US market still is really important, and for right now, they can't do without it.
Okay, political scientist Ian Chong, thank you very much for speaking to us.
My pleasure.
Now, US President Donald Trump has given Mexico another 90 days to reach a trade deal with the US or face steep tariffs. Dozens of countries are now racing to sign deals to avert Trump's tariffs as the August 1st deadline looms. Now, those who fail to get an agreement face a steep hike in levies, some as high as 50%.
US President Donald Trump unveiled his trade tariffs back at the beginning of April on what he dubbed Liberation Day. Trump placed crippling levies on dozens of America's trading partners. He came down hard on Washington's three biggest, Mexico, China and Canada, claiming the tariffs were, in his words, retaliatory for their unfair trade practices. Most of the tariffs were later amended or postponed until the 1st of August to allow time for negotiations. Since then, a number of major deals have been brokered. The European Union, Indonesia, Britain, Vietnam, South Korea and Japan have all struck deals with varying results. For example, prior to Trump's second term, the effective US trade rate on Japanese imports was less than 2%. Trump was threatening to raise that to 25%. But their new deal sees Japan looking at 15% in duties. The UK was paying about 1.3% baseline levies previously. Trump then said he would raise them to 20%. But the new negotiated deal between the US and the UK sees that fall to 10%. And last year, goods from the EU faced about 1.2% tariffs in the US. During negotiations, Trump threatened to raise that to 30%. But after the EU made some painful concessions, that amount has now been fixed at 15%. But the details of the agreement with the EU have not yet been made public. The deal is largely verbal, with fine print still to be worked out. But its supporters say at least the bloc has a framework for future trade with the US. China, on the other hand, the hardest hit by Trump's tariffs, does not yet have a deal in place. And neither of America's neighbours have a settlement with the White House either. Trump's other demands alongside the tariffs have proved major obstacles. He's threatened Mexico with high tariffs unless it curbs the flow of illegal migrants into the US. And Ottawa and Washington are still far apart on several issues, with Trump threatening Canada over its plans to recognise Palestinian statehood. Bilateral agreements with several other countries, including India, South Africa and Brazil, have been hindered due to political reasons, indicating Trump is not just pushing for economic change.
Let's discuss this further with Kimberly Clausing. She's a professor of tax law and policy at the UCLA School of Law in Los Angeles, California. Thank you for joining us, Kimberly. Now, Donald Trump claims that the tariffs will, in his words, make the US great and rich again. Will this happen?
No, the tariffs are really own goal for the United States, and they hurt the United States in some really important ways. People are fond of describing them as if the foreign country pays for the tariff, but it's not the foreign country that pays for the tariff. U.S. consumers pay for the tariff. The goods are going to get more expensive in the United States. An estimate suggests that this could cost the typical family about $2,000 or more over a year. That tax increase is much bigger than any tax cut that they're getting from President Trump's signature tax bill that just passed. So about 80% of Americans are going to be worse off because of these tariffs. They're bringing in a lot of revenue, and President Trump has bragged about that, but that's sort of like bragging about a big tax increase on yourself. A second group that's hurt by this is U.S. businesses. You mentioned the Mexico example earlier in your program, but the Mexican economy produces a lot of inputs that are used in U.S. manufacturing processes. So we've actually seen manufacturing employment decline in the early months of the Trump administration, in part because of all this uncertainty and the higher cost of imported intermediate goods. And more than half of our imports are intermediate goods used in manufacturing production. So that hurts the U.S. economy's ability to produce. And you see that in the economic statistics. Right. Growth is down this year. Inflation is up this year. It's really not a win for the U.S. economy.
Who's actually winning? And if we look at some of the U.S.'s trading partners, are any of them winning in these tariff deals?
One of the great things about international trade is everyone can win. You know, you exchange things that make both countries better off. They're gains from trade. One of the sad things about a trade war is that nobody wins, right? You're hurting both the importing country by levying these taxes that I just described, but you're also hurting the exporting country because they don't have as much market access as they would have had. So I think the reason all the countries are coming in and trying to bargain for the best deal is they're afraid of being relatively disadvantaged compared to other trading partners of the United States. So if you're Korea, you don't want your car tariffs to be higher than the car tariffs for Japan or for Europe. So everybody's coming to the Trump administration trying to make sure that they're not relatively more worse off. But this situation is an unwinnable situation. It's destroying the gains from trade, both for the United States, but also for trading partners. I think the situation is slightly better for the trading partners because they still have each other, right? The United States is reducing trade with every country in the world at once, but Germany and Korea and Japan, as examples, can all trade with each other, and Australia and the whole rest of the world without having the same sort of dynamics. That's at least good news for the rest of the world.
Okay, I'm afraid we've run out of time there, but I'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much, Kimberly Clausing of the UCLA School of Law. Thank you for your thoughts.
My pleasure.